Welcome to Ground Truth. Join Sam Faddis as he looks for truth from those on the ground, in the middle of the action with key insights regarding critical national and international issues. Listen for discussions and interviews on national security, terrorism, politics, espionage, the paranormal, and weapons of mass destruction.
Welcome, I'm Sam Faddis. This is WKCV 103.5 FM, the voice of Keystone College in beautiful La Plume, Pennsylvania, where we're still enjoying Indian summer. Don't know how much longer that's going to last, but we'll see. We're talking today about nuclear power plants, and we're talking about security really is the primary focus. And we have a gentleman that I think you're going to find fascinating, a guy that I've known for a little while, Scott Portzline, who, you probably don't know that name if you're the average listener, but I will guarantee you that if you are in the nuclear power industry, particularly anything related to security, that you know Scott very well, and you know him by reputation because he has become one of the premier experts really on this topic. And he is a wealth of information, and he is a truth teller, and sometimes staggeringly prescient. Years ago, when the Fukushima thing happened, literally when the news of the tsunami was just breaking and most of the press was trying to figure out how to spell Fukushima, I got contacted by Scott, who I already knew by that time, who basically told me in very capsule format exactly what had just happened and exactly what was going to happen in terms of a meltdown at the nuclear power plant before anybody else on the planet, as far as I could tell, was even considering the possibility that there was an issue, because he understood precisely how the plant works, how the backup systems work, what the seawater had done to the fuel for the generators, and just blew my mind. I mean, literally, there were probably 10,000 guys in the U.S. government sitting around still scratching their heads, and he had already jumped right to the heart of the matter. So that's the kind of insight we got for you today. Scott, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. You're right about the knowledge that it takes to understand sabotage and terrorism involves safety issues, how plants work, and so when the Fukushima problem happened, I was able to interpret the little bit of scrolling across the screen about the earthquake in Japan being a 9. They thought at that point that Japanese nuclear plants were not designed to withstand that type of an earthquake. And so early in the morning, I called the CNN cable network to tell them what was going on, and an hour and a half later they called me back and thanked me and invited me down to Washington to go on TV with them. But I had stayed up all night and I didn't think I'd be fit to go on television, so I had a buddy of mine. We both had predicted that there would be a hydrogen explosion, and of course that's what happened.
So before we start just jumping, both feet into the meat of all of the dire things associated with security and nuclear power plants and so forth, I just want to stop for just a second and ask you to explain how you came to make this, I'm going to call it your life's work. I mean, how you came to immerse yourself in this and become the expert that you are.
Well, back in 1979 when the 3 Mile Island accident happened, that's 11, 12 miles from my house, I was actually an entertainer, and my band was up in Thule, Greenland, which was the site of another nuclear accident, this one involving a lost bomb. And while I was there, I talked to the Navy SEALs and the Seabees who were searching for any remnants of that bomb because Greenland was about to gain its home rule from Denmark. Also, while I was there, I snuck into this top-secured radar site. It's NORAD's distant early warning line where the radar would look over the top of the earth to see if there's any missiles coming our way. So I easily walked in using my as a library card at the suggestion of a worker who wanted to show me what he did during the day. And so I rode out on a bus, military bus, the 45-minute ride. It's only 13 miles, and snuck in with the force and started reading the signs about how you could get shot if you don't belong there. I thought I better get back outside. When I came home from Thule, Greenland, the accident happens at TMI. The first thing I said to my friends, and I was pro-nuclear, what happened? What went wrong? And a bunch of them were saying, it looks like it was sabotage. There's been some things in the newspaper. So skip ahead to 1984 when I found out that there really was some evidence. I went to the official investigative reports, the President's Commission, the Rogue Event Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's report, and found that they also suspected sabotage, and that the President's Commission actually requested an FBI investigation. So that sucked me into examining over 40,000 pages of documents and hours of tape depositions and my own interviews with local people who had details about the suspects. And once you're into solving a mystery and you have a knack for engineering and enjoy that type of thing, I was doomed to a lifetime of trying to do good to prevent more sabotage at nuclear power plants.
Well, listen to that whole topic of lost nukes. That sounds like a whole nother show, probably several shows you and I could do, because I think most people have no idea how many lost nukes there have been over the years. But let's jump back onto nuclear security here for a second. And you and I talked a few days ago getting prepped for the show, and you mentioned to me that one of the things that you're focused on these days in terms of security of nuclear power plants is the threat from drones and how those can be used and what the danger is. Talk to us about that for a little bit.
Yeah, the drone issue is actually very old in my mind, because when I used to go water skiing outside the plant at 3 Mile Island before the accident, I would imagine, how would somebody attack one of these nuclear plants? I don't know why I had that thought, but I did. And I thought how easy it would be to build your own drone, a 10-foot wingspan on a small Cub-like aircraft, and then put 1,000 pounds of explosives on it and the radio-controlled gear necessary to fly into a nuclear plant. And nowadays, they have more sophisticated drones with sophisticated engines. In fact, what happened in France in October 2014 is really worrisome, because on one evening, drones probed all 19 of France's nuclear reactor sites. 5 of the incursions occurred in a space of 6 hours, which placed the government on high alert and showed that it was a sophisticated, coordinated effort. And there was hundreds of miles between the flights, suggesting that it was an advanced plan. So they used helicopter-like drones with powerful engines, some of them big enough to hold explosives, yet the drones were so small that they couldn't be detected by conventional radar. And they looked like, they had 3 white lights and a large red light. And when they got to the nuclear plant, it would shine like a spotlight, possibly linked to a camera to maybe do surveillance. They never found out. Sam, that's the thing that scares a lot of people, including me. They never found out who was responsible for that. At first, they suspected Greenpeace, but Greenpeace hadn't done it. Now, a few years later, just last year, Greenpeace crashed a lightweight drone into the Lyon nuclear plant spent fuel pool. It was decked out to look like Superman, and they were trying to demonstrate that they still have serious vulnerabilities to drone attacks at the French nuclear plant. Now, you can see video of that Superman flight online, but here in the United States, we have no defenses against drones at our nuclear plants.
Right. And I got to think, by the way, having had some contact with Greenpeace over the years, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, they're not really known for doing things and not taking credit for it. That's as you noted with the Superman example. If they do it, they want people to know they did it. But you're talking about drones and the possibility of using for surveillance and to carry explosives. And of course, we just saw, and I mean, we've now seen multiple examples in Saudi Arabia of attacks, including one on a major oil facility, doing exactly what you're talking about. Let me, though, hit one point here that I think is important for listeners. The usual response of people from the other side, if you will, I don't know if it's the other side, people associated with nuclear security, is something to the effect of, well, the reactors are inside this hardened structure, and therefore, who cares if they crash a drone? That doesn't begin to describe actually how nuclear power plants work or how vulnerable they are, does it?
No, in fact, I don't mind that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission tells lies publicly about whether or not they're vulnerable. But what I do mind is that behind closed doors, and I've participated in some public workshops on security, behind closed doors they continue to believe, well, it's probably not going to happen. There's no way we can predict it's going to happen. Therefore, the odds are so low. We'll get away with just saying, well, we didn't think it was going to happen. And that's exactly what happened with the Fukushima accident, by the way. They thought a tsunami of that height couldn't occur. So what we get from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is statements like you're saying, or once I was told by a Nuclear Regulatory Commission, this is back in 1993, that, the airport could see whether or not somebody's going to fly into a nuclear plant. Now, here at 3 Mile Island, it's 2.5 miles from the Harrisburg International Airport. there's no way for them to detect the termination point of that flight, let alone do anything about it or stopping it. We think in the United States we have no-fly zones over nuclear reactors. We don't. We don't have that. But even if we did, we still don't have a way to stop flights over the reactors. So you're right. I have a video clip of Chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Ivan Selin, in 1993 or 94, saying that you probably wouldn't even need to have a bomb on some of these aircraft, including the small ones, that just a fire alone could be enough to start a disaster.
Right, and you're talking about drones or aircraft to take it off, and obviously if we're talking about a drone, even a fairly large one, it doesn't even necessarily have to take off from a formal airport of any kind, right? I mean, down the road from where I'm living now, there's a small community which is built around a grass airstrip, and everybody in that community owns a small aircraft, and they take off from a grass airstrip. I mean, it's not which could just as easily be a field and not be in regular use as a runway. Just to touch, I don't want to get into the business, neither do you, I know, of writing a primer for bad people, but just to make sure people understand the vulnerability, if you will, of a nuclear power plant. Going back to Fukushima, the central problem with Fukushima is you lose power and you lose backup power. People think, okay, I just shut off the reactor, but it doesn't work that way because a reactor produces such enormous heat that you have to continue to cool that thing even after it's been shut off for a very long period of time, or else you get what we saw in Fukushima, correct?
Yeah, some reactors, they'll get to a safe point, a fairly safe point, within about 3 days. And you're right, there's a lot of leftover fission products in the reactor that are still fissioning. And we believe that if we can run the batteries at the nuclear plants, then that'll give them enough time to solve the problem. But that's really not the case. That's not reality. In fact, that's one of the things that I saw come across the screen at Fukushima, how they were rushing in emergency batteries. And that's how I knew they were in a station blackout condition, which is seen as the largest threat to nuclear plants. So once I met behind closed doors with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to show them how the new images that had just come out on Google and Bing, and Bing was actually called Live before, L-I-V-E, and it revealed such detail at the nuclear plants. I could see things I hadn't ever seen before, including where the guards would go on top of the buildings, the sniper nest that they have set up defensive positions, and you could easily plan to overcome the guard defenses and attack certain systems. One of the things I showed the men at that meeting was, you see these structures on top of this building here as we're looking at the high definition picture in the new photograph. I said, those structures tell me that's the location of your emergency diesel generators. Those are the ventilation systems for those. And they looked at each other dumbfounded and said, wow, he's right. And I showed them some things that they can't see because it's the forest for the trees. You know, they're so close to it that they miss the eyes of an outsider.
So let's shift gears for a little bit. Talk to me about cyber and what the danger is from that you see.
Yeah, cybersecurity is a real danger. Maybe the biggest reason is it's so easy to convince yourself that now I'm safe, or never had a problem in the first place, which is what the NRC believed, because they thought they had old analog systems, and they found out that it was some of the easiest penetrations when testers, an IBM tester, went inside the plant and had control of it within a couple of days. Could have caused a meltdown or done anything he wanted to do. My big concern right now, that one thing that I want to get changed, is that the same people who are writing the defenses for each nuclear plant, cyber defenses, are the same people who are testing it. So you got to have an independent source. How do the people writing it know everything, all the ways in? They don't. So how are they going to find a problem with their own system? They already know the answers. You know what I'm saying there. And then the other thing is, we don't have what's called a situational awareness program, where if there's any cyber or computer troubles at a nuclear plant, within the first 15 minutes, whether it's understood or not, it should be reported to a clearinghouse set up by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That way, if there's a concerted effort to take down dozens of nuclear plants, that they'll be able to pass on information that quickly. Right now, we're in the dark in that area.
So when you're talking about cyber, just to, again, to make sure that people that are listening are clear, you're not just talking about somebody hacking a database, stealing information, or accessing details. You're talking about the capacity to remotely cause ultimately physical damage to the plant, right?
Oh, yeah, and to the land, to cause a meltdown. That's exactly right. There's so many ways to do it. One of the simplest ways would be to overload the networks within the systems there so that they can't function and perform their backup duties and safety functions. One thing that the United States did to Iran in 2010 was install the Stuxnet virus into Iran's uranium centrifuges, so that they couldn't make their weapons-grade uranium. And what that virus did was cause the centrifuges to spin so rapidly that they flew apart and they destroyed themselves. The whole time sending a signal, the data to the controllers that everything's okay, all systems normal, the speeds are the right amount, the temperatures are good, and all the pumps are working right. So you can do this man-in-the-middle attack, or you can do an even easier attack of just overloading the systems with too much traffic, like a denial-of-service attack to the computer controllers in the plant.
Right, and it doesn't do you much good to be claiming you have all these safety features if, as you just indicated, you can basically fool those or spoof those, and so they don't kick in, they don't turn on. We've made reference here several times to a meltdown, and I think people have heard that term. It's commonly used when you're thinking about security at a nuclear power plant, but I'm not sure that most people understand what we're talking about. I mean, just in generality, what does that mean? If a nuclear power plant melts down, what happens and what are the consequences?
Well, it's a loss of coolant accident where the uranium fuel, heats up to over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit and actually melts through the fuel assemblies, which is the container for, there's thousands of fuel rods in the nuclear plant, and it'll melt through the metal of the reactor into the concrete of the reactor building, possibly, and then into the groundwater, which is what we really have in Fukushima. We'll go into the details on that another time, but in Japan, they're still pretending that it didn't go through the floor of the reactor, and yet they're wondering why they have this groundwater infiltrating the plant and sending hundreds of tons of radioactive water into the ocean every day. And that's just a horrible tragedy. But the other thing is, we try to classify almost all nuclear accident threats as being the meltdown. You can have a problem, serious catastrophe, without the meltdown. What we could have is a spent fuel pool accident where the water drains out of the fuel pools, and then the heat that's still left in these fuel rods takes the temperatures up high enough to start a fire. And then the particles that are released from the spent fuel pool building could contaminate areas, 30, 40, 50 miles away, causing evacuation. So some of the new technologies that the industry is claiming will be meltdown proof. It doesn't matter that it's meltdown proof. It has to be foolproof for releasing radioactive matter into the air or the water, and nobody can do that. That's impossible.
So, God forbid that this scenario ever comes to pass, and I think 3 Mile Island is supposed to go offline. But walk us through, just to put the bones on this thing. If there's a meltdown at 3 Mile Island, what does that mean for the surrounding area?
Well, TMI did have a partial meltdown in 1979. It did close about a week ago now, so it's no longer operating. There were 2 reactors there. The one that wasn't damaged was allowed to reopen in 1985. But what would happen is logistically, the government would be told by the NRC how bad things are getting at the plant. There'd always be confusion during a meltdown or some sort of serious accident. And there's going to be people on the governor's panel whose job it is to order the evacuation, and they will be so reluctant, and they'll be hearing conflicting information. One sort of data, one group of data will be telling them things are getting out of hand, you need to evacuate. And another body of data will come to them saying, oh, but things are not as bad as we think. And see, this also happened at Fukushima. It definitely happened here, and it happens at any nuclear accident, that confusion. So the evacuation order comes too late. And once you have, which happened here at 3 Mile Island, when the NRC commissioners had the responsibility to order an evacuation at that time, or to advise the governor for an evacuation, and once they got to that point, it was too late. The clouds of radioactivity were already over the population. Now we're seeing an increase in lung cancer, brain cancers, and leukemias. And there's debates about that, but there's a lot of information that there was a cover-up and manipulation of the data, and that's easily examined too. It's actually very complicated, but when you talk to a couple scientists that I'm familiar with, you can easily understand certain things that happen, including not taking measurements from some of the radiation detectors in the field.
Right, and what you're describing in regard to 3 Mile Island is, we're using a very imprecise term here, meltdown. This is not, but it's a partial meltdown. We have seen much worse than this, obviously, at Chernobyl and Fukushima.
Yes, well, Fukushima was a total meltdown. Meltdown is a generic term that is very vague, actually, so we don't need to blame ourselves. There's many different conditions, and as I said earlier, there's other ways to release radioactivity. In fact, when you start talking about drones again, a British Prime Minister is worried that ISIS is trying, and they have evidence of this, intelligence is trying to make drones deliver radioactive materials over cities and disperse it that way as a radioactive dispersal device.
So, Scott, we're going to run out of time here real fast, but I want to come back to something that you brought up earlier, which is this whole business of the spent fuel rods. And explain to us what that is, and then what happens to them after they're taken out of the reactor, and where are they kept, and what's the plan after we're done with them?
Well, once the reactor goes through what they call the burn-up cycle for the fuel, they lift the fuel assemblies out of the reactor by taking the head off the reactor. Now you have an increased risk, at least temporarily, because you could have a fuel handling accident. There was just a fuel handling accident out at San Onofre a couple of years ago where they dropped a cask, which is ultimately where the fuel ends up. But in the meantime, they put those in spent fuel pools where it takes at least 5 years for them to cool down until they can be put into a cask. And then these casks basically sit in the parking lot, as I like to say, at the nuclear plants. Here at TMI, they'll sit in the pathway of an international airport, which I think is totally unacceptable, vulnerable to an air crash with all the fuel that would burn and so forth. Then they handle the fuel again and put it onto trucks or trains to transport it across the country. I live beside two transportation routes for high-level nuclear waste. One is Route 81, so it's the highway transportation, and the other is the Lucknow train yards here in Harrisburg. And I've witnessed rule breaking, I've witnessed the vulnerabilities, and I've reported all of these things to the governments and have advised them they've got to do something to disguise these trains, because the train car itself is painted green like the Department of Defense military green. It has extra sets of wheels, or trucks they're called, because the weight is so tremendous. They're all marked DODX, and I said, you've got to do something about that. At least put some sort of tarp over it and skirting around the car so you can't see it. But I've seen them sitting still right here in Harrisburg, and they're never supposed to stop in an urban area, of course, for the vulnerabilities of being struck by some sort of serious weapon like a rocket-propelled grenade.
So, as we're getting ready to close, I've got these spent fuel rods. They're out of the pool. They're in a cask. You've talked about they're basically just sitting around on a concrete pad. What happens if somebody blows that up? What's the consequence?
Well, the consequence would be to the immediate area, unless there's a fire. It would be the fire that turns out to be the delivery system to carry that away from the plant. A flood is also another problem because the transport system, it would take the radioactivity downstream with it. And there's believe it or not, the dry cask storage is the best way to go at this point, but we're making deals with the devil. In reality, when you start to examine all this and understand the risk, it's very easy for some people to come to the conclusion that we never should have bitten off this technology. It's more than we can handle. And when you look at the bills coming due for the storage of these nuclear waste for the next 100,000 years, then you'll understand economically it's been a disaster.
Well, Scott, we're going to have to call it there for the day. I want to thank you very much for coming on with us.
Yeah, and thank you.
And thank you for listening. We'll be with you next time on the next episode of Ground Truth.